Representative Castro is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I would just say that if you can find us a 19-year-old Medal of Honor winner who'd love to serve in the U.S. government, we'd love to have him, rather than this 19-year-old who's a mystery man and got fired from his last job. As y'all hear a lot of angry, fire-breathing rhetoric coming from the other side, I want you to consider, as Americans, where we started the year. Our country, for all of the complaints and all the anger, is still the most powerful, prosperous nation on earth, with the lowest unemployment rate in decades and a strong economy, where foreign aid represents about 1% of our total budget. And yet, Elon Musk and this administration's attempt to illegally shut down USAID and freeze ongoing foreign assistance programs has been met with support and applause from some of the world's worst authoritarians. Venezuelan Interior Minister and Nicolas Maduro's key lieutenant celebrated the Trump administration's actions in ending support to the Venezuelan opposition. In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega's sons said that, quote, Trump turned off the faucet for terrorists when he shuttered USAID funding. Belarusian leader Lukashenko applauded the administration's decision to cut funding for, quote, the fugitive opposition. The opposition that for years Republicans have said they support, they have now abandoned. President Trump has abandoned. He cut off TPS for Venezuelans and betrayed the people of South Florida and sent them back to a man he says is dangerous, yet sent Rick Grinnell to handshake with. After this administration's halted funding to Cambodia to remove unexploded bombs that the United States dropped on their country years ago, China offered to move in and replace U.S. funding. China has offered to go do the job that we are no longer doing. What do you think that does for American diplomacy? What do you think it does for our reputation around the world? What do those people think of us that we won't help them take away the bombs that we dropped years ago? Similar celebrations have come from leaders in Russia, Iran, Hungary, Cuba, and other countries as we've cut support to democracy activists in these countries. Democracy activists. Republicans have been eager to accuse Democrats of, quote, abandoning our allies. The reality is that the Trump administration abandoned our allies everywhere, and it didn't even take a week. Donald Trump has abandoned those fighting for democracy in Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, and China. He's abandoned Taiwan, freezing security assistance to the island nation facing threats of invasion from China. Donald Trump abandoned our partners in Indonesia, Malaysia, Iraq, and other countries fighting terrorism with the support of USAID. He's abandoned the country of Jordan by freezing security assistance, abandoned millions of victims of HIV/AIDS supported by PEPFAR, and abandoned those suffering from malaria and TB. Donald Trump has also abandoned American citizens, American farmers that feed the world, whose produce is rotting in ports and warehouses, and our USAID professionals and families that he stranded abroad. Make no mistake, these decisions will come back to haunt the United States of America. And not only in terms of diplomacy, not only in terms of how people think of us in faraway lands, those diseases that we're no longer helping to cure, people will get sick not only in those countries, but in the United States. And I hope that just as folks are taking credit for what's going on now, that when those diseases hit the United States, that they will take full credit for that. I have a question of the panel. I want to ask Mr. Natsios whether you think these actions, you were a USAID administrator, you saw the good and the bad, and you had reform. I had a reform bill myself, which some Republicans joined me on last Congress. You think the totality of this is making us stronger in the world or weaker?
I think that our aid program makes us stronger, and I think USAID, prior to all of the controversy, was achieving that, except for the woke program that has been introduced, which has alienated very conservative Christian societies in Africa.
And Mr. Natsios, I want to interrupt you for just a second, because there was an example of funding to help LGBTQ communities in Uganda. In Uganda, the death penalty was proposed for gay people.
Right, right.
Is that considered woke? Is that what they're using as an example of woke, is helping gay people because they're under the threat of death by their own government?
Any violence against any person is not acceptable. So I understand what you're saying.
So you would be for that funding then?
What I'm saying is that we're dealing with very conservative society, Muslim and Christian, and we need to respect not what you're talking about, because that happened, I think, in reaction to us, actually, because it wasn't there before. But let me just say that we give, AID gives $1 billion a year to Christian NGOs, evangelical, Pentecostal, Roman Catholic, my church, the Orthodox Church, and mainline Protestant. $1 billion a year. All those programs are now frozen. They've laid off the staff, and I have to say it's damaging the church's mission in the world. I think this whole shutdown is, and I might say, Mr. Chairman, just not to be partisan, I'm just to tell you what's happening. I've met with the Christian groups. Even though they have waivers, the Phoenix system is not operating. Unless the Phoenix system can operate, they can't issue checks. No one is getting funded, even though the waiver has been granted. I'm not saying that in a partisan way. Please do something about it. It's having an effect in the field in a profound way. A lot of AIDS orphans are being taken care of by the church.
Gentleman's time has expired.
And the staff has been laid
Gentleman's
off.
time has expired. Representative from Kentucky, Mr. Barr is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the very important hearing.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Tulsi, you and I came into the Congress together in 2013. And Cash, you and I was serving on the Intelligence Committee when you worked on the Intelligence Committee. And John, you and I are both from Texas, and we both served together on the Intelligence Committee. The idea that this information, if it was presented to our committee, would not be classified, y'all know is a lie. That's ridiculous. I've seen things much less sensitive be presented to us with high classification. And to say that it isn't is a lie to the country. I want to ask the generals now. The NSA is principally in charge of intercepting things like signals intelligence from other countries. General, I want to ask you, if your organization, your agency, intercepted something like this from Russia or China or some other country, would you consider this classified information?
Representative, we would be classifying based off of our sources and methods. So those would be the things that, in terms of how we process, how we would be able to obtain the information and how we'd report it, we would classify based off of our source and method.
So if you knew that the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor of Russia or China and the head of the Foreign Ministry and all of the folks who were associated with that signal chain, if you intercepted that information, General, would you consider it classified?
So it would be classified based off of our collections.
So the NSA would classify it? Would
based
determine
off
it as classified.
the protection of our own source and method, not necessarily based off the content, but how we collected that information.
But it would be classified.
Well, we certainly wouldn't be collecting on a U.S. person conversation.
No, I understand. I'm saying
if
you did your job and collected it from the Russian Foreign Ministry and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense and the President's chief advisor, there is no way, having sat on this committee for 9 years, that somebody would come in with that information and give us something that says, unclassified, you can walk out of this room with this information and give it to whomever you want. You know, with all respect, you and I worked on the committee at the same time. Tulsi, you and I came in together. I've never had an issue of beef with you. John, you and I are both from Texas. Y'all know that's a lie. It's a lie to the country. I want to ask about the Alien Enemies Act really quick while I have time. The President has used the Alien Enemies Act, a wartime authority last used to detain German and Japanese nationals during World War II, to summarily deport people accused of being members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Agua. To invoke this law, the President must demonstrate that the United States is under invasion by a foreign nation or government. They have alleged that we are under invasion by the Venezuelan government. The idea that we are at war with Venezuela would come as a surprise to most Americans. The unclassified version of the annual threat assessment the intelligence community just released makes no mention of any invasion or war that we are fighting with the nation of Venezuela. You would think our nation being at war would merit at least a small reference in this threat assessment. And Director Ratcliffe, does the intelligence community assess that we are currently at war or being invaded by the nation of Venezuela?
We have no assessment that says that.
Thank you. In invoking the law, the President alleged that Tren de Agua is, quote, undertaking hostile actions against the U.S. at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Director Gabbert, does the intelligence community assess that the Venezuelan government is directing Tren de Agua's hostile actions against the United States?
There are varied assessments that came from different intelligence community elements. I'll defer to Director Patel to speak specifically to the FBI assessment.
But let me ask you, so you're saying there are conflicting assessments that have come from the IC?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. We'll take it up in closed session. All right. You know, your threat assessment makes issue of, highlights fentanyl trafficking as a top threat to the United States, yet support for law enforcement cooperation with Mexico has been put on hold, and there's been a threat of invasion to Mexico by the United States. You assess that Russia's advanced cyber capabilities make it a persistent counterintelligence cyber threat, yet the administration shut down the unit at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency tasked with stopping Russian cyber attacks. There are so many other ways that the actions of this administration have contradicted this threat assessment, and the administration is making the world and the United States more dangerous. I yield back.
The gentleman yields.
All right. Thank you, Chairwoman. Yeah, I want to take up this issue really quickly because, you know, we disagree, Maria, on this. I don't think there's ever been a bias of the United States against conservative leaders and in favor of leftist leaders. In fact, when you look at the history of the U.S. involvement in Latin America has often, I mean, the United States, unfortunately, in decades past, worked to undermine the leadership of leaders on the left and treated leaders on the right as friends. And in fact, supported what were some of the most brutal dictatorships, like the Pinochet ruling in Chile. And so, you know, when we think about how we provide U.S. assistance, how we provide taxpayer money, the way we should be thinking about it is who is operating consistent with U.S. values and what we stand for. So democracy, freedom, respect for human rights. Really, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, whether you're on the left or the right as a leader, we ought to support leaders who are pursuing those things. And so Consuelo Porras, as I understand, have been sanctioned for severe corruption. That's why we're not working with her, not because she's got a certain ideology. You know, and Bukele also, I think it's true. I mean, he has gotten a lot of crime off the streets and has scared a lot of people, especially young men. But so has Xi Jinping in China. And so, you know, if the question is, well, why don't we just let people do what they're going to do? Okay, I get that. But the question for us is, are we going to back them up with money to commit human rights abuses and other things that we would never allow for in the United States ourselves? Now, bear in mind, in the last few weeks, we've seen some disturbing instances of people literally been picked off the street for having exercised their First Amendment rights by government agents who don't identify themselves, who aren't dressed in uniform, and who barely present credentials, if at all. Those are the kinds of activities that you're used to seeing in countries that violate people's rights. So just, you know, with that disagreement, let me get into a question really quick. Ms. Kenney, as you know, the administration is conducting multiple reviews of foreign assistance programs, and I believe those programs have been incredibly disruptive and that the review has not been done in good faith. In 2019, the first Trump administration did something similar on a smaller scale. They unilaterally froze $400 million in foreign assistance funding in Central America for over 14 months. At the time, I, along with other colleagues, requested the GAO assess the impacts of that freeze. The GAO determined that many programs, including State Department INL Bureau programs, had been adversely affected. And based on your experience with the 2019 freeze, do you expect adverse effects from the ongoing freeze on many INL programs?
Thank you for that question. Yes, when we reviewed the freeze in 2019, we found that there were a number of adverse effects. To the State Department, we found that about 65 or 39% of INL programs actually suffered adverse effects, where they had to reduce the geographical region in which they were implementing programs. They had to reduce the number of beneficiaries who could participate in trainings. They had to reduce the quality of programs. And programs that relied on implementing partners suffered even more consequences because they had to lay people off and they were unable to pick up those programs when the funding resumed. However, that funding was really just a freeze of one-year funding, and in a lot of ways those programs were able to continue because of funding that was still available in the pipeline from prior year's funding. We haven't had an opportunity to review the funding freeze that is occurring right now, but my understanding is that those programs aren't able to access prior year funding either, and so my understanding is that they're not continuing at all. We haven't had. I'm sorry.
Sure, no, and thank you for that. And let me ask a follow-up really quick. Will the GAO be willing to conduct a review of the ongoing freeze and cancellation of hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign assistance programs?
Yes, we'd be happy to do that work.
Thank you so much. With that, I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Castro. And now,
thank you, Mr. Perry. I now recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. Ms. Stroll, in your testimony, you recommend that the Congress, quote, strengthen the administration's hand by beginning the process to conditionally authorize the use of military force against Iran's nuclear program if the regime proves unwilling to take sufficient steps to ensure that it will not acquire nuclear weapons. And I guess that recommendation gives me some concern based on history. This was the same argument made to justify voting for the Iraq War in 2002. In debates in the Congress, they argued that a show of resolve by Congress by preemptively authorizing the use of military force against Iraq would strengthen the Bush administration's hand in negotiations and force Saddam Hussein to come to the table. What ensued with the Iraq War was one of the biggest mistakes that our country has made in decades. And I don't think any of us, or most of us at least, want to repeat that same mistake. And I'm concerned with everything going on now that we could with Iran. The American people are not looking to get into another protracted war in the Middle East. I think most folks would agree with that. I'm also skeptical that the votes are there for such a war. Skeptical that the votes are there. In February 2020, bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate voted to end hostilities with Iran after the strike on Soleimani. During the congressional debates on the repeal of the 2002 Iraq AUMF, some Republicans attempted to ensure that the law could still be used to strike Iranian-backed proxies. In response, a bipartisan majority in the Senate, including with the crucial support of now Vice President J.D. Vance, voted 60-36 to stop those efforts. And so my question is, would you say that we should strengthen the administration's negotiating hand by preemptively authorizing the use of military force against Iran? Do you trust Donald Trump and his administration with that responsibility at this time?
Thank you so much for this question, and I think it's a very important point. So the words I chose were begin the process to conditionally authorize, and I think those two clauses are important in the point I'm making. One is begin the process. That is because I don't think that this decision should be left in the hands of any president without advice and consent and consultation with Congress. And conditionally, because I'm not recommending preemptive authorization, I am recommending that by members of Congress having debate about the conditions and circumstances under which it would approve use of military force, it will send a signal of bipartisan consensus and commitment that that credible military option remains on the table should negotiations fail. And I want to be very clear that my recommendation associated with Mr. Rule is that we should pursue negotiations first, because no military action will eliminate the knowledge and the entire program overnight.
And so I guess what would per your recommendation, what would that trigger be? When do you start down that road?
First, I think the intelligence community should be providing regular updates to members of Congress in a closed and classified atmosphere on exactly what the steps are that the intelligence community understands Iran to be taking. And secondly, I think there should be consultations about exactly what is being contemplated when we talk about military strikes on Iran.
Would you require that we go through a JCPOA type negotiation before going down that road?
I think that testing the diplomatic waters with the regime, either in a multilateral context, in the indirect negotiations that appear to be contemplated at this moment, either way, a negotiated settlement is by far easier to verify in implementation and blocking Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon than military force, which on the other side, we don't know what regime decision-making would be, we don't know what Iranian decision-making would be, and we don't know what the war looks like on the other side of that. And this is why I think there's such serious issues that merit congressional input.
Thank you. And also for the other witnesses, just for the record, as we're having this discussion, do you believe that we should do a preemptive AUMF?
I associate myself with Ms. Stroll's comments. We should have a thoughtful process in which Congress plays its rightful role as an institution, but the Iranians must understand that endless negotiations aren't the only strategy of the United States.
Sure. Thank you. Let me check in with you.
Yes, and I agree with Ms. Stroll and Mr. Rule.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Castro.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, I have served on this committee for, well, since I got into Congress in January of 2013, and have always supported a comprehensive authorization of the State Department. Doing so is a core responsibility of this committee and is our best opportunity to strengthen American leadership and diplomacy. And this committee has, in recent years, been successful in passing and enacting authorizing legislation to do just this. I've had the opportunity to contribute meaningful legislation now enacted to strengthen the State Department, USAID, and the Foreign Service. In drafting this legislation, though, there's always a balance that we strike. The language must be specific enough to set direction of the department, but flexible enough for our diplomats and foreign assistance professionals to implement the laws in an ever-changing international landscape. This has, for decades, been a careful balance built on trust and good faith between each Congress and each administration. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has abused this relationship and dynamic. The Congress has for decades authorized specific programs and agencies. USAID, the Inter-American Foundation, the U.S. African Development Foundation, the United States Institute of Peace, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Bipartisan laws have established each of these agencies and their programs. Laws continue to direct funding for these agencies and their programs. In each of these cases, the administration has directed the agencies to reduce operations to, quote, minimum required by statute, essentially closing the agencies down. They have abused the flexibility afforded by the law to essentially terminate these programs. An authorization to do something without a requirement that it specifically be done is being interpreted as permission to ignore congressional intent and refuse to undertake the activity. In the current environment, if the Congress wants a law to be enacted, it seems the language must be very specific and bind the hands of our diplomats so that they have no flexibility. So I wanted to ask Ambassadors Jeffrey and Hale, how effective do you think our diplomats would be if the laws provide the department little to no flexibility because the Congress cannot trust the President of the United States to faithfully execute the laws of the United States?
The Secretary of State and his or her subordinates need a considerable amount of flexibility to carry out the intent of Congress. I don't want to get into what is, in the middle of a very partisan and hot debate. What I would say is it's very important that Congress not just authorize an activity or an agency, but state what the goals are in general terms. We can then operate in terms of what the military calls troops to task to figure out how to do that, what the procedures are, what kind of people we need. But general guidance in some detail is always good to know which direction you're going. And again, the trafficking in people, it was very clear that Congress wanted us to put an end to this. And we've done a pretty good job.
Ambassador.
Yeah, no, I would agree very much. And I would also, underscore state the obvious that, the world changes. Foreign policy needs to be nimble and adroit and able to respond to emerging problems that we didn't anticipate. Maybe we should have, maybe we shouldn't have, but we didn't. And we need to be able to have a consultation with you all here on the Hill about those emerging and changing threats and opportunities as well, and make sure that we have the flexibility we need, but also we're connected to you. And it's not just a matter of when you have your confirmation hearing or when you're called up for a very formal event, but the ongoing consultations with members and staff.
Sure. Well, USAID, the Inter-American Foundation, the U.S. African Development Foundation, the United States Institute of Peace, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation have all been established by law and have existing valid authorizations. Yet the administration has moved to eliminate all of these entities. It has abused and exploited the difference between the spirit, or the gap between the spirit and the letter of the law. And so far, this committee and this Congress have allowed the president and the administration to do that. Perhaps we'll see in the coming years, but forever resetting the balance of power and control between the executive branch and the president and this Congress. That is going on in real time right now. This committee and this Congress are surrendering influence and control over our diplomacy to the President of the United States. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary. Thank you for your testimony. I want to say at the beginning that I think that in terms of roles in the cabinet, that coming into your job, I think you're the most qualified cabinet member in a cabinet that I think has otherwise been incompetent and unqualified. You and I are obviously of different political parties, but we share kind of a similar story. My grandmother, Victoria Castro, came to this country when she was 6 or 7 years old as an orphan because both her parents had died after the Mexican Revolution, and the closest relatives who could take her in were not in Mexico. They were in San Antonio. And when my grandmother came to Eagle Pass, Texas, the manifest that allowed her to come, there was a question that was asked on that document. And the question said, purpose for visit. And her relatives that were bringing her, they wrote in to live, that she was coming to live. You have an incredible family story of your parents and your grandfather coming from Cuba in the 1950s and maybe early 1960s, and a similar background of helping you and your siblings pursue their American dreams, just like my grandmother did for my mom and for us. But I feel like today, under the Trump administration, our grandparents may have ended up in a gulag or banished in Guantanamo, or like the girl that I visited with who was a U.S. citizen in Mexico a few weeks ago with a brain tumor, having her seizure medication seized at a CBP inland port. And her mom, who's undocumented Mexican, her caretaker, 24 hours a day, not allowed to come back with her to get treatment for her condition. And I want to ask you specifically about a policy decision where on February 5th, DHS Secretary Noem rescinded temporary protective status for Venezuelans. This same thing was used for 700,000 Cubans in the 1960s and 70s. And she stated that in consultation with the Department of State, assessed conditions in Venezuela and that there are, quote, notable improvements in several areas such as the economy, public health, and crime that allow for these nationals to be safely returned to their home countries. And you said as recently as a few years ago that returning and failing to renew TPS for Venezuelans would be, quote, very real death sentence for countless Venezuelans who have fled their country. That was a few years ago. And so I wanted to ask you, do you believe after everything that Maduro has done, and you and I have both condemned him, as I think almost everybody on this dais has, that TPS recipients forced to return to Venezuela will truly be safe in that country? And how do you justify the decision to send 350,000 people to Venezuela right now?
Well, 350,000 people have not been sent to Venezuela. I think you're referring to the TPS cancellation of the temporary status. So 2 points. Number one is, unfortunately, that blanket approval of TPS gave TPS, including to people that, frankly, we should not have allowed in this country, irrespective of what part of the world they came from. Number two is the hope that now people that have received TPS will apply through the asylum process. And I believe many of them, if not most of them, will have very credible asylum claims to make for the reason you've just outlined. I think that problematic is that when you do a blanket TPS, number one, it's supposed to be temporary. None of these TPSs ever go away. But number two, when you do a blanket, especially in a mass migration event, it is going to protect and cover people that, frankly, we should not have allowed into this country. The overwhelming
I mean, we're both part of the same Latino community. You're not saying that all 350,000 people were gang members, are you?
Of course not. The majority are
you
not.
saying
But
that
if
they
1,000
were-
of them are, we got a big problem.
Well, yeah, but so because there is a very small group who are criminals, just like any group of Americans, you're saying that none of them get any due process? They're just automatically expelled?
No,
like
they
no
have a right
review,
to-
no nothing for any of their cases?
Well, again, it's not my department. We don't do asylum claims, but I
Well,
can
but
tell
she
you they
said
can
she
apply for
consulted with
asylum.
you. She said that it was her decision and your decision, and a few years ago you said it was a death sentence.
Yeah, but the problem is the previous administration did a terrible job of vetting applicants for TPS. They just blanket approved it.
They
So
did
now-
things that have been done in other administrations before.
But never in this
Republican and
mass migration
Democrat.
event. Look, the bottom line is, of course, the overwhelming majority of them are not gang members, and they will be able to apply for asylum, and they have a very credible claim.
I have
but
to
there
yield.
are some that are, and
I
they
have
need
to
be
yield my
removed from our
remaining
country.
time. I got it. I got to yield my remaining time to. Thank you, Chair. Thank you all, each of you, for your expertise and testimony today. We started the year as the most powerful, most prosperous nation on earth. And the way I approach it is when you're going to make changes to that, those changes better be such that they make us even stronger. That's not to say that there aren't deep challenges that we face, particularly domestically, issues that we need to address for workers and so forth, and even in trade policy. But I think it's fair to say that the last few months in terms of economics around the world and trade policy has been chaotic. I remember when President Obama was in office, one of the critiques of the American business community of his presidency was the uncertainty. Everybody was using that word, the uncertainty. Well, if that was uncertainty, this is chaos. With tariffs changing from day to day, a million different negotiations supposedly going on with different countries. And one of the effects, as I have had meetings with embassies and with foreign leaders, is that the world is starting to move around us. And Ms. Cutler, you mentioned diversification, and I imagine you meant diversification. Countries are diversifying their own economies and their trading partners. And I want to see if you would speak to that a little bit with respect to Asia. And the fact that as to them, from their perspective, not our perspective, but to them, as we become a less reliable trading partner and economic partner, what do they do?
Well, it's not only that they're viewing us as unreliable, but they're also viewing us as no longer as interested in the rules-based trading system. And so I think both of those factors are motivating other countries to become less reliant on us and work with countries where they have common interest. And frankly, for many small and medium-sized countries, a strong WTO, for example, is in their interest. What we're seeing now, though, is countries forging new agreements and expediting negotiations that seemed impossible just years ago. So, for example, the UK and India just 2 weeks concluded an agreement that was under negotiation for many years. We've seen now the European Union express interest in somehow aligning itself with the CPTPP, something that for years they said they would never do. And we're also seeing other countries express interest in either joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or CPTPP or different digital agreements. And ultimately, as all of these agreements are being forged without us, we are disadvantaged. We do not get those benefits. And so I think this trend is very concerning, and I hope that we can work together to find a way to convince our partners that we want to engage with them, we want to seek win-win agreements, and that we still see merit in a rules-based international order.
No, absolutely. And I think it is fair to say that this has been a kind of shake-up, but the world is not a snow globe. Things don't just go back to exactly where they were once everything settles down, right? I'm the ranking member on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee and was meeting with folks from Mexico who said they're pursuing a free trade agreement with Brazil, for example. And so you see different regions of the world trying to come together in their own ways. Mr. Goodman?
Yeah, I totally agree that this is really the problem, that we used to write rules, get others to agree with our approach to rules, standards, norms of international economic behavior, and that was very much in our interest. Frankly, it was in their interest too, but it was ultimately in our interest, and we're giving up that by not having some kind of more affirmative offering of our preferred rules, including, by the way, I meant to say earlier to Congressman Barra's point, in the digital space. I think that's really critical, where we pulled out of an effort to try to get people to agree to our preferred digital rules. So we need to do more of that, or others are going to make other arrangements.
Everybody, 20 seconds. Other witness and quick comments.
I'll just say that from my perspective, that the rules-based system is broken. The global trade order is no longer something that we have been able to manage. And the problem behind this is China. And this requires a reset of significant magnitude. Why? Not only because we need to rebalance trade, but because we need to free our defense industrial base from dependency on Chinese supply chains, and we need to move towards real wage growth and productivity in this country. And we won't get there if we continue to be in this deficit orientation without a rebalancing of trade.
My time's up. I apologize.
I now recognize Ranking Member Castro for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I know in your testimony just now, and I think in your written testimony, you stated that you're often unaware of what programs the department funded or operated, and that suggests unaccountability. And Tom, you served in the same role in the Obama administration, I believe, and wanted to ask you, is it accurate that as Assistant Secretary you had to sign off on all the funding recommendations?
Absolutely, yes. I find this very strange. I signed off on every single grant program. I reviewed every single grant program. If I had questions, they were answered. If I had concerns, they were addressed. Congress was briefed on every grant program at that point that it wanted to know about. It was briefed on grant programs it didn't want to know about. That wasn't the issue. And DRL, one of the hallmarks of what makes it so good is that it actually has an office of people who are dedicated to grant management. These are very small grants going to small organizations, often in developing countries, and so the oversight function of DRL is especially important, and one reason it needs to be empowered and not dismantled, as the Secretary of State is intending to do. I understand you all have been briefed that the people overseeing these grants are either going to be fired or moved into the regional bureaus, which I think former Assistant Secretary Destro and I agree would be a bad idea. So there is oversight. DRL is key to it, and that's why it needs to be strengthened.
Thank you.
And by the way, there will be nothing to oversee if everything is cut. So we are kind of rearranging the deck chairs of the Titanic here unless we focus on the fact that everything is being eliminated.
No, I mean, to your point, and that's why I said this is not reform, this is sabotage. This is a total dismantling of the infrastructure for diplomacy for the United States. But let me ask you, the administration's skinny budget proposes cutting all funding to the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, making claims about a lack of transparency and disinformation. Dr. Kirk, are you aware of the claims made about the NED? And did the administration reach out to the NED or its grantees to seek information before making these claims?
Thank you, Ranking Member Castro, for the question. I appreciate it. The charges against the NED from OMB and the skinny budget were frankly news to me. I'm not here to defend the NED. I do know they responded with a fact sheet, which I have here. I'm happy to submit for the record. What I will say is that individuals making similar accusations never at least knock on our door and say, hey, we have concerns about X, Y, or Z program. Can we discuss it? Often the charges aren't backed up with any evidence. There's no follow-up. The NED are audited, they report to Congress, and the USG, frankly, quite frequently. So the bit about them not being transparent, it just baffles me.
And the administration's cuts to democracy and human rights programs was far-reaching and included significant cuts to the International Republican Institute's programs. Can you speak to how these cuts were made? And did the administration seek information from you all specifically before making these decisions? And did you feel like it was a thoughtful and deliberative process?
So what I'll say about the foreign aid review is any administration has the right to do it. We supported it from day one, and certainly there were some programs cut that, in my view, were not sufficiently linked to advancing U.S. national security. That said, there were many that were cut that were, in fact, advancing U.S. interests. Tell me how it's not in our interest to be supporting the people in Cuba, Iran, China, elsewhere. To your question, Ranking Member, about did the State Department reach out for information, the former F-Director of the State Department, whose name now escapes me, his office never came to us asking for that information.
You know, we spent years talking about the threats of China, both to the United States, to our allies, but also to their own people, nations like Cuba. And I actually agree with you on Cuba, although I would say that we've, for some time now, pursued a strategy that failed a long time ago, and we should have made the change some time back. But let me ask, does anybody agree that cutting the diplomacy budget by 85% is actually going to make the United States safer and stronger and more secure around the world?
Well, Mr. Castro, if I can respond.
Please,
I mean,
yeah.
there's nothing like a hanging to clarify the mind. I mean, that's I'm sure that's a negotiable figure. And that's
well, let's say it ends up at 50%. Do you think it's good at 50%?
I can't answer that question. And the reason is it's what you're spending the money on. It seems to me when we talk about things like countering China.
Well, but China's increasing its funding, right? It's not decreasing its funding.
Of course, but the question is how do you counter China? And one of the ways you do that is by increasing the independence of the countries that you're working with. Some of that's going to be trade policy. Some of it's going to be human rights funding. I've spent a lot of time working with people in West Africa about how do we use trade funding to do human rights. I mean, these are not incompatible. In fact, our programs here in the United States, human rights in the workplace, is one of our most stellar human rights achievements in the last century.
Right, but they cut all the labor rights programs. And I mean, I think what you're describing is a situation also where the countries are not likely, I mean, it could be possible, but aren't likely to become stronger and more independent on their own. They're more likely to rely on some other nation like China or Russia, which is, I think, what's going to happen.
Well, again, I don't disagree. I don't think we disagree about the importance of it. But a good friend who is from a South Asian country that will remain nameless has come here to study. Her Secret Service came to her and said, you're working for the CIA. And she says, well, are you telling me I shouldn't come? To which they said, no, we just want you to know where the money's coming from. That's the perception. If that's the perception, it's not a big surprise why a country like India enacts something like our Foreign Agents Registration Act. So, I mean, actions have consequences. It's the how. Diplomacy is about how. It's not about whether.
I've gone over my time, so we'll have to continue the conversation another time. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Now I recognize the Representative Sarah Jacobs from the state of California.
Thank you, Ms. Chairwoman. And thank you all for testifying.
Thank you, Undersecretary, for your testimony and for being here today. What's happening in Gaza is a horror of mass starvation, mass murder, and even a plan for ethnic cleansing that Americans are helping to pay for. Every day brings us fresh horrors of starving children, in fact, some of them starving to the bone, civilians killed by snipers while they seek out food, and entire families wiped out by the IDF. And as I mentioned, and as you know, Americans are helping to pay for it. I wanted to ask you what the Trump administration's plan is to stop it. As we and the world witnesses these horrors, what is your plan to stop it?
Representative Castro, thank you for your question and for allowing me to respond. When we talk about Israel-Gaza, I think it's important to remember two specific things. First, this situation started on October 7th when Hamas invaded Israel and killed nearly 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, in the most heinous and barbaric ways. Second, I think we should also emphasize that Hamas could end this conflict today. It could put down their arms, they could return the hostages.
But certainly you're not
Hamas
suggesting,
agree
hold on,
to a
I'm going to
ceasefire.
reclaim my time for a second. You're not suggesting that those 5- and 6-year-old kids have any control over what Hamas does, are you? In fact, those folks in Hamas, the people who make up Hamas, many of them are hidden away in tunnels or out of Gaza and are not the ones who are being subjected to these bombs and missiles and starvation and so forth.
What I was going to say, Congressman, was that we mourn the loss of any civilian life, whether that's Israeli, Palestinian, whomever. And that's why we're focused on achieving a ceasefire. It's the laser focus of President Trump and of this administration.
Well, Undersecretary, I guess I want to tell you, just for a second, I want to tell you when Anthony Blinken sat where you're sitting in December, I believe, I told him that I was disappointed with how the Biden administration approached this and that we didn't do enough during that time to stop these horrors. And I will say the same thing to you as part of the Trump administration, that our government is not doing enough. We have all on this dais called out Hamas for the horrors of October 7th. We have labeled them even before this as terrorists and penalized nations or anyone who has associated with them. But what actions have we taken against Benjamin Netanyahu's government for the horrors that they've committed? Where are the consequences for their action?
Thank you, Congressman. What I was going to say was that we're very focused on achieving a ceasefire and delivering humanitarian assistance. As you may be aware, and I think there was some press reporting overnight, that Special Envoy Witkoff is going to be leading the engagement. He's headed to the region right now to work to finalize the aid corridor and reach a ceasefire. So you asked what we're doing. That's one of the things we're doing is Special Envoy Witkoff will be traveling to the region to work on this issue.
Let me raise another issue with you, because Israeli settlers in the West Bank attacked the Palestinian Christian village of Taibeh, setting fire to a cemetery and a 5th century church. U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who's been a very strong supporter of Israel, called the attack, quote, an act of terror, and that they should be, quote, found and prosecuted, not just reprimanded, unquote. He similarly described the lynching of Palestinian American from Tampa, Florida, Saifola Musalet, by Israeli settlers in the West Bank as, quote, a criminal and terrorist act. That's 2 acts of terrorism within weeks by the same group of people, Israeli settlers in the West Bank. I want to ask you, will the United States be pursuing independent investigations into these terrorist attacks by Israeli settlers?
Thank you, Congressman. I understand that the IDF is investigating incidents.
Will the United States government launch an investigation into these attacks?
And as I said, Special Envoy Witkoff is traveling to the region, and it's very much in President Trump's interests and his objective to reach stability in the region. He's working on ceasefires.
Will you guys commit to an independent United States investigation into these attacks?
Thank you for asking that question. I don't have an answer for you at this moment, but I've provided you with an answer to your question on what we've been doing on this issue and how we're working towards a ceasefire.
I yield back.